We're live, a little bit late, but we had some technical issues, so they had to be fixed. It was no screen, no mouse, no nothing, so it was a bit difficult to do anything. But so sorry for that. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thanks for joining. This should be nevertheless should be a fun session, but we might have some technical issues all the way, so we'll see how it goes. But
Yeah.
please be patient. Hi Adam, how's it going?
Hey,
How's your how's your adrenaline level?
good afternoon. Yes, it's so for well, let's give a little bit of background as to what happened. So, I've got a brand new Mac Studio that I've got just a couple of days ago. Setting everything up on it seems to be working fine. But I went to change the screen resolution to make it better for this stream, and in doing so, now the screen of my monitor has gone black. And yeah, we've literally just spent the last half an hour trying to fix it. So it's been a stressful time, but I'm now back on my old laptop, and we'll just see how it goes. I had a lot set up and a lot prepared, but yeah, now it might be a little bit of a struggle. But if anyone out there knows how to fix this issue, then feel free to ping me, send me a message, and I'll send you all the free t-shirts that you want. It's a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, or we fix it live on stream. So if you indeed have know how to do this, then I'm sure Adam would be appreciating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we go into the actual topic, I want to take the opportunity and quickly talk about Nodes 2022. That's coming up in November, but until 20th of August, we have the call for papers open. So if any and all topics around graphs and Neo4j are welcome. So if you are thinking about presenting or have presented something somewhere and want to do something new or something else, please don't be shy. Go to neo4j.com/nodes 2022. There's the link to the call for papers. Submit your sessions. It could be anything from early stage and easy beginner level to very hardcore technical deep dive stuff. We have lightning talks, we have regular sessions, and we have workshops which take a couple of hours. So anything goes really, as long as it obviously is around graphs and Neo4j. So yeah, if that is something you want to do, have a go at it. And Node is fun, so I think Adam, you can speak about that as well. You've been participating in a couple of the past, so it's a nice environment, a nice atmosphere. It's online, obviously, so no face to face, but still, I liked it a lot when you see how the people interacting and engaging and discussing. So it's cool.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the benefits for me is I get to I either meet or see or see people talk that I wouldn't get the opportunity to sort of to see, because obviously it's not like a face to face. You're not dragging people into one location. So yeah, sort of people from all over the world presenting what they're doing on Neo4j, and it's a really cool thing to like for me as a Neo4j advocate to kind of see what people are doing and how they're using Neo4j, because I mean we've got the 5 use cases that we use regularly, and then there's these things that pop up like ICIJ and sort of like use cases like that. But like seeing like all these weird and wonderful ways that people use Neo4j is really interesting to me.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, but today we are talking about Neo4j with JavaScript, Node.js, TypeScript, and more. Ask me anything with Adam. I have, yeah, I'm here for a little bit, and then you take over. So if you have any questions in chat and anything you want to know, in particular, it could be topics are wide, and I think the range is a pretty wide one. So type it in chat. We'll have a look, and Adam can answer almost all questions on the topic. Yeah, would be nice if you would interact a little bit, engage. Let us know if you don't have a question, or maybe give us feedback. Right, that's also possible. Let us know how you're using Neo4j with JavaScript, maybe what you're working on currently. If that is the case, anything you want to share, you want to talk about, it can be, anything goes really. It's a free session. And you have here's your screen. And
cool. Cool. Yes, the reason this has come about is that last week there was a release. So on the 22nd of July, there was a release of this podcast called Syntax FM. If for people that know Neo4j, may not necessarily be users of JavaScript or know the Node.js ecosystem like that, they may not have heard of Syntax. Basically, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to give the listeners of Syntax an opportunity to either see Neo4j in action or to come and ask their questions if they've listened to the podcast and they're not sure what's going on. So if you're a Neo4j user that hasn't heard of Syntax before, I definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you're interested in front end development. So I just think that I maybe didn't. I suppose in terms of like the time frames, like everything is kind of squashed up. You don't get a lot of time to put things across. I feel like maybe I didn't answer some of the questions to the best of my ability. So it's a good chance to set the record straight on that. But also some of there are just some things that we just couldn't get to, or some things like if we're talking in terms of like Neo4j, like some things you can't show. So I thought it would be interesting to demonstrate some of those things as well to listeners of Syntax.
Yeah, I think it's always when you talk live, then it's you know what comes into mind is sometimes maybe not the perfect answer. I mean, I had a live session yesterday actually, and we talked about data loading in Neo4j, and they were saying they were scraping networks basically and loading the data into Neo4j, and that they say they need to be careful because Neo4j has its limitations obviously in writing. So if you have lots of data, then you want to write in simultaneously from your network into the Neo4j database, so then it could come to bottlenecks that then the database is not quick enough. What can you do? And there are some ways around this, and there's some way to alleviate this, but this is obviously then I found I remembered something just before the end of the show that I can actually, going back to this could be another way to help that problem, but it's in a live scenario. It's sometimes the better answer comes to you after you hang up, and then it's like, I should have said that. And showing something is always better, I think. I mean, especially with Neo4j, you can talk about it and you can explain it as much as you like, but if there's no visual guidance, then it still sounds more complicated than it necessarily is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And so one of the things that I found on this podcast as well is I was talking about Neo4j, and I was talking about, like we talk about this whiteboard friendly model, and nodes and relationships, circles, arrows, things like that. And I found it's really with like Cypher as well. It's like really hard to explain what a graph database is without like kind of showing something like arrows on screen, or like a data model or some data on screen.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely something that is easily explained visually. I was talking like saying like this is the whiteboard friendly model, and this is how we write a Cypher query. But when you're saying like, imagine that you've got these circles on a piece of paper and you've got lines between, like it's difficult. Whereas actually I can just write on screen, like person in like something like that, and then like it's obvious that these are like circles, and this is like an arrow. This is an arrow or something going between the two.
Even this is already better than just talking about it. I mean, it's still not the visual representation, like you mentioned, arrows or data importer or something, but already this makes it so much more clear. I think yes, yeah, it's
yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'm trying to find some notes that I had as well. But I can't find them. But yeah, if anyone is watching has got any questions or anything like that, just stick them in the comments, and we can take it from there. Really. I have the screen open, and if worst comes to worst, what I'll do is I'll work through the Graph Academy course. So if there's anyone out there that's not aware of Graph Academy, it's the site that I'm working on at the moment. So it's our free self-paced online hands-on online training platform. So we've rebuilt this platform over the last year or so, and we're starting to build out the content. So the idea is this gives you everything that you need to be successful in Neo4j. So you can learn anything that you need to learn. So talking of nodes, back in, I think was it nodes 2020? I did a talk on how I'd analyze the traffic through Neo4j documentation and developer guides. So if you've been on the Neo4j docs or developer guides in the last, I guess, last couple of years, you may have had like this little survey come up in the bottom right hand corner. So typically it wouldn't happen on the first page view, but it would come on like the second, if math.random is more than 0.5, or whatever the case was, is a random thing. It asked you one or two questions. So it was either what is your experience level with Neo4j, or what is your role? So typically we see like, I guess, like 3 or 4 types of users for Neo4j. So we've got the developers, people like me that are building applications on top of databases, data scientists who are trying to use graphs to improve their predictions and their machine learning models, and then we have administrators that just want to run Neo4j, make sure that something is running on port 7687 that the application can connect to. And then we just got kind of other people that just kind of, I guess, like data engineers as well that are interested in like sort of data pipelines and things like that. So the idea was, as the users moved through the website, that information was saved into a Neo4j database. And then we could see, based on the role and experience level, what kind of content people were interested in. And then, so that basically gave us the kind of learning paths that people would take. So generally, what I would see is that everybody was interested, well, maybe not administrators, but everybody else was interested in sort of some key topics. So there was the fundamentals of Neo4j, so like, what is a node, what is a relationship, how does this differ from a relational database or some other database, and just the kind of the fundamentals, maybe the kind of things like a sales guy would need to know as well, like, or somebody who had heard lots of people in the company talking about graphs but didn't really know what they were on about. So I think this is like the episode of Friends where Joey is talking to this sales guy for well, I guess it's like hours, like a few cutscenes, and then he tries to sell him these encyclopedias, and he's like, "Well, I can I'm at home during the day. Like I can't afford all these encyclopedias. So anyway, he buys this one. It was like W or something like that. So I think that like this is like this is the equivalent of that. So this allows you to kind of talk in graphs without without really having to break a sweat. Then we got the fundamentals of Cypher. So like, you know, I mean, we talked about the Cypher query language, but like what is a match clause? How do I query the graph? And then once you know how to query the graph, like data modeling is important because I don't know if this is something that I said on the podcast, but it's really easy to write a bad query in Neo4j. So the modeling fundamentals just basically helps you to improve the performance by basically touching less areas of the of the graph. And then once you know, oh, sorry, Karen.
No, I was saying it needs some a little bit of a change of perspective, a little bit of change of thinking about how to do it, especially when you come from SQL based systems, and then you come from there and you think, okay, I can basically use what I know and make it into a graph, and that is not sometimes that's not the best way to do it, and sometimes that's not a good way to do it. And then you this is a great session, and it's not so long, right? 2 hours to get a little bit about how is it working, what are the key concepts, and what are some best practices for doing it. And then obviously it depends, unfortunately it depends on your domain and on your data, you know, questions and the queries, and what you want to do with your graph in the end. But if you have the basic concepts right, I think you cannot go totally wrong. But if you don't do this and think, oh, this is just I know this, I have modeled data for all my life, there's no problem for me, then maybe spend some time and look at it, because it, you know, there are some pitfalls, and then you will realize that then your database is slow and not as responsive as it should be or could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a few tricks as well that you can pick up inside there, and best practices and things like that. Because it's not so you like in a relational database, you do this like third normal form, and then you abstract everything out so it sits in its own tables, and you have your own like foreign keys and stuff like that. Data modeling in Neo4j is completely different to that, so it sort of guides you through everything that you need to know there. And then after that, we've got the import. So you've got a graph database. You know what a graph database is. You know how to query it. You know the best way to model your data. Then what's the best way to get it into Neo4j? So there's built in a command in Cypher called load CSV, and then this course takes you through that. We've also got this data importer tool, and there's a whole module on using that data importer. So that's a GUI, like a graphical user interface, where you can go through and you can you basically take a CSV, you this was all set up on my computer.
Yeah. Of course, yeah, that's not a problem.
On the
but
other one.
Yeah, no, it needs to start. But yeah, data importer has been released. I want to say a couple of months ago, so fairly new still. Earlier this year. So it makes it. You know, if you remember arrows, so that was like a tool we provided to get data modeling, like a whiteboarding session, basically done in a graph friendly environment, so you don't have to worry about setting up nodes and relationships and stuff like that. So basically you drag and drop your nodes and relationships around, and you create a graph from a blank canvas. So that makes it super easy. It was able to give you some kind of help with how to load that data then in your database, but it was not really connected anywhere, and it was not very polished in that way. It was more, I think it was more like a whiteboarding tool in the end. data importer is different. Data importer uses, I think, is based upon the arrows tool in the backend, but you can create your nodes and edges with the tool. But then again, you have a CSV file you can connect to that, and then the trick is coming together, right? And then you pick a node, and then you pick a CSV file, and then you connect those two, and then you pick a relationship and do the same, and then everything is there, and then you just click on connect, and then the data gets loaded into your database, and that could be a desktop instance, it could be Aura, it could be somewhere else, and then you load it in there, and then you see the model, you have created that model on your canvas, and then you load the data, and then the data are in your database, and you can go from there. Yeah, you see.
Yeah. So I'm not going to reconnect these files up, but you can kind of see that we've got these files in there with certain pieces of information. So this is, I guess it's a mapping of a relational database, or like an export of a relational database. We've got like a movies table there. There's a people table, then acted in and directed, are kind of the relationships between them.
Yep.
And then what you do is, so again, the whiteboard friendly model, or like a very visual, visually friendly model. Like we can create nodes, the relationships between them, and then map those to the files. And it just makes it really easy to import stuff in. So you don't have to know any code. You don't have to learn Cypher to get to this point. You can just head on and just import it straight in, which is really useful.
Super easy. Yeah, I think that's an important point you just made. Is you don't have to know anything about Neo4j or Cypher. You drag and drop your files. You draw up some graph, model your data. You import that data into your graph database, and then you can from there you can even skip browser altogether and open it up in Bloom and use natural language type query, and then just go to there, and then you didn't have to write a single line of Cypher for that. You basically just go from tables to graph in a couple of clicks. Obviously, at some point you will have to do some writing in Cypher and some stuff to perform and to get what you want. But technically, you get very far already without knowing Cypher.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess like you kind of saw like how quick that was. It's 3 seconds to import in how many rows. So I mean, we're talking 3,000 users, 3,000 ratings. 93 moves. It's not a huge data set, but all goes in within 3 seconds. You can then download that, download the model, or download it with the data mapping in there as well. So you can share it with other people if they need to. And I think I've just added it into my main database. But so we've got casino. These are all the people that have rated casino. So you can see the people that have acted in there as well. So I've got Joe Pesci there, and James Wood, Sharon Stone, Martin Scorsese directed it, and then all these people that have rated the movie. Cool. So I see our first question has come in. So hey Peter, thanks for asking a question. Anybody else, don't be shy. But the question that he has asked is, I'm interested in creating a customized GUI for adding, editing, and viewing Neo4j data. Any hints for getting started? So this is I guess a multifaceted answer. I guess it depends on what kind of technology that you want to use in order to build the application. If we're talking just like a front-end application or a single-page application or something like that, you can connect using the Neo4j JavaScript driver directly through the browser. So this is exactly how Data Importer works. So what happens is when you build a connection here. That then creates an instance of the Neo4j JavaScript driver, which I will load up here. So you install from npm using the package manager of your choice. And then you connect using a connection string, which is built up by that login form, and then some authentication. So in this case, basic is username and password authentication. And then what you do is you would then build up a state in your UI, which would then translate into a Cypher query, and then get sent straight through, sent through through the driver to the Neo4j instance to create or view the data. So regardless of what you do, if you're building a front-end application that connects with Neo4j, you would do that. Yeah, there are options that you can use for I guess for many of the frameworks. So I wrote a set of hooks for Neo4j called use Neo4j. And this would be the best way, in my opinion, as the author of this library, this is the best way that that you would connect through a React application. But it basically uses the same kind of hooks architecture in order to connect to Neo4j. So one of the really nice things is it when you include in the provider, by default, what it will do is if you don't provide a driver as a property to that, then it gives you a login form. So caveat, this doesn't work with React Native, so it's something that someone's raised to me. But if you just build in a general React app, then yeah, it'll give you a login form, and then it creates the driver in the background. But then once you've got that connection to Neo4j, you can then use one of these hooks to execute. So there's a use read Cypher and use write Cypher functions that you can use. Both return this Neo4j result state, which is this here. So basically, you can say I want to use this read Cypher. I'm passing through a Cypher query, which will just be a string, and then a params, which is a map. And then, so you can take the loading state, you can take the first, you can take all of the records. If there's an error, then you can access that as well. And then there's this run function as well, which allows you to rerun. So you could have like some sort of effect in there. You could have a state for like I don't know, like the actor's name. And then when somebody types in the box and then changes the actor's name, then it reruns the query and then gives you the results out. And then yeah, you then render them straight into JSX, which is quite nice. So again, that's that. So if we've got the matrix as the movie we're looking for, match every movie node where the title contains, in this case, metrics, and then return the values. And then when that query changes, you would then just realize that there's a typo now. I need to put set query. But yeah, you'd use that effect and then keep rerunning that query, which is quite cool. So I hope that answers the question. If there's any follow-up questions to that, then feel free to shout out.
There was a follow-up. I don't know. At least Peter asked another question. Is the best strategy to make calls to Bloom using JavaScript in order to create customized GUI?
So in terms of using Bloom, so I suppose it depends how you want to use it. But if you're only interested in the visualization element itself, then there are other libraries that you can use to do that. You can basically embed that as an iframe, and then there's like a query parameter that you can use for the search. Yeah, it is. I'm not quite sure where that's ask me to connect to. But you can basically say like search equals people acted in movie, person acted in movie, and then it will appear inside that search box. So the exact thing is on the developer guide. And for the answers to the question, is there an implementation for Vue as well? There is. So it's called Vue Neo4j, but it's not been updated in a while. So I'm not sure whether it works with Vue 3, but definitely with Vue version 2. If you use this plugin, then you then get access to this .neo4j, and then you can run your queries through there as well.
I posted all the links in chat, so you should be able to click on those to access.
So again, if you're only interested in the visualization element, then what you can do is you can take the nodes and relationships that get returned from a query, and then put them into a library like VizJS, which is a visualization tool. So you just have to define the nodes and the edges. So in this case, the edges is the relationships from Neo4j. But basically what you need is an array of the relationships with the start ID, end ID, and then any values against that. And that's probably the quickest way that you could do that. There are other libraries are available. So with both Bloom and Neo4j Browser, they both use D3 and the D3 force graph layout. So you can do exactly the same thing there. So yeah, Francois, D3 is absolutely. So it's just a case of converting the Neo4j format into the format that the implementation requires. So say we've got, this is the graph that we've got. Can we see this? Right, I don't know if we can actually see that value. Or I use this code. Cool. So definitely a must be where I can find that. Here we go. Cool. So you basically have an array of the nodes. So in this case, we've got the name is the, I guess is the, oh no, so the position in the array for this one would be the ID of the start and the end node. And then I guess this does some, maybe makes the line between the two thicker.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, we'll probably be able to see. Yeah, so we've got thicker and thinner lines there. But yeah, I mean, it's just a case of translating stuff into the format that you're interested in. So yeah, site escape is another one. You can use it. all these have different different formats that you need to put things into. Yeah, kind of nice styling on the fly there.
Yeah, that's pretty nice.
Which is cool. And I've actually used this one in the past, this Tokyo Railway. So I did it with the rail network in the UK, and then for a project basically mapping cables like throughout the UK.
Okay.
For a telephone company, which is quite cool. So again, like, this is all like SVG stuff, and so yeah, that's it's probably the best way to go about that. So I mean, none of it is rocket science. It's more a case of just working out what that format is and how to convert the Neo4j values into a value for the library itself.
I guess they all have slightly different scopes and pros and cons that make them more suitable for one application versus the other. So yeah, I guess it depends on what you want to do and what your exact idea is, and then you can pick the one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And with the D3 plugin as well, like it's you I forget that code up again. It's more of a case that you use certain pieces of it to create the layout, but it's kind of flexible, so you can use elements from your arrays in order to do things like change the width of the line, or for the nodes, you can either take a group of nodes based on a label and then just change the display in that way, or yeah, you can do whatever you need to really. It's just being as like, I guess it's how much time you want to spend right in that. But yeah, so hopefully that answers a couple of questions. So that one from you, Peter, and Rich, Jose, yeah, and Francois. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. If you've got any more questions on that, then feel free to.
There's one more from Isa Lies. She says, I need a tool for maintenance of knowledge base. Sorry, I need a tool for the maintenance of a knowledge base, i.e. Arrow's app interacting directly with a standard Neo4j database. Need a tool for the maintenance of a knowledge base. So Arrow's app is not that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Arrows is more for before you have your data and you put it into the database. So what would we recommend for somebody who's already got a graph in there? So I guess it depends on whether you want to build the tool yourself or whether you want somebody else to build it for you. So there's projects like again, it also depends on like what the visualizations that you're looking for are. But let me think off the top of my head. There's people like Linkurious, which works well with Neo4j. Solution. So they have their own solutions, and then you can build on top. So you can kind of see from there that you would drill down and you would you could view data from there. Who are the other ones, Alex?
There's Hume from GraphAware.
Yeah.
Which also, I think it's specifically for knowledge graphs. So this is a very, Curious is more like a general visualization tool. Hume is more, has more specific graph, knowledge graph applications or optimizations, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say this was more of an end-to-end kind of solution built on top of Neo4j. So you can do things like import your data in. There's different types of visualization and ways that you can analyze the data on there. There's also like a machine learning element to it as well, and an AI element.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I prefer to build these things myself. So I don't know a lot about these third-party tools that are available.
There's one more I can think of, which is Semspect.
Semspect, yeah.
From Derivo. So that's another tool I know that they are using, or they are being used for a couple of knowledge graph applications.
Yeah. Yeah. So the cool thing about Semspect is it kind of like groups things together, and then you can kind of drill down to go into the certain elements. So it's definitely a different way of using it.
Yeah.
So one of the things I did when I opened the stream is I opened up Neo4j Desktop. So this is like a tool for local development. But one of the things it gives you is this concept of like a graph app. So graph apps are single page applications built with JavaScript and then installed to desktop. A lot of them are available online as well. So what you can do is you can go to install.graphapp.io, and then this gives you a list of all the tools that we've got available at the moment. So actually, this should have been the place that I started, because it's got Semspect on here. It's got GraphXR by Kinaviz, which is another interesting one.
Yes, true. Yes, GraphXR. Yeah.
And then so Y-Files is another one of those where they give you a JavaScript SDK and you can build your own stuff on top of that. So I've used that on a couple of projects before, not for a few years, but saved a lot of time in terms of like not having to worry about D3 and things like that. You just they have like presets that you can play around with.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So as a tool for the maintenance of a already existing database, I would say that Hue might be the best place to start. So did I close that window? Yeah, so the GraphWare guys are really nice. Definitely have a chat with those, and then see what they can do about Hue. Yeah, I think the challenge there is the editing of the graph. Really, I can't think of any of those where they actually allow you to edit. But I think if you start off with the install.graphapp.io, you can download the trials of some of these things, check out, see what they're like. If you like them, then you can have a chat with their sales guys, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. If there's any follow-up question, or if that didn't answer the question, then yeah, feel free to ask again, I suppose.
Cool.
All right. Cool. Yeah, so I was talking about the Graph Academy before, so let's jump straight back into that, or jump back into that. Yeah, so the once you've completed the beginners courses, you should know enough to be proficient in Neo4j. You might not. You might still have a few questions, so you can go into the curated learning paths. The one I will highlight for, I guess, anyone that's watching this stream now would be interested in the courses for developers. So we've got 5 official drivers. So .NET, Go, Java, Python, JavaScript, Node.js, and you can use the JavaScript driver with TypeScript as well. But so basically, what these courses do is they start off with a pre-existing website with like hard-coded responses in there, and then as you go through the course, you learn all about the driver. how it connects to Neo4j, how to add it into an application. And then you start to replace all of the hard-coded API responses with responses from Neo4j. So you learn about sessions and transactions, how the driver actually works with the database, how you access the results of a Cypher query through the driver, the type system, and there's a big gotcha with the JavaScript driver and the way that numbers work between Neo4j and JavaScript. So that's in that lesson. And then you basically go through and then you do, for example, like a read query on the home page. So you edit the home page in order to display like the latest movies and the most popular movies. And then write queries with registering a user. So you actually add a user to the database. Start to handle the driver errors. So the challenge there is to add a unique constraint to the database and then listen for errors that come back when you try and register the same user for a second time. And yeah, you just go through and keep building on that until you've fleshed out the application. So if anyone is interested in that, then that's graphacademy.neo4j.com/courses/app-node.js.
Cool. And just type in it. And you built it all on Neo4j. So I think I saw you written a blog post about this a couple of weeks ago. I think early July or something on Medium.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
yeah.
So
do you want to share a little bit how you did that?
Yeah. So I mean, so this was again going back to the syntax FM episode. I was really frustrated on the podcast that I didn't mention the details of how I built Graph Academy. So for the people that haven't listened, which I'm assuming is most people, we started to talk about so Wes's site. So Wes produces a lot of both Wes and Scott both produce like really high content video courses for things like JavaScript and Node.js, React, everything Node.js and JavaScript related. And so Wes was talking about his sites and how they may be built on top of Neo4j. And he was saying, we've got a user or a customer, and then the customer buys access to a course, and then the course has got videos and et cetera. I didn't go into detail, but that's exactly the way that the Graph Academy is built. So that really just motivated me to write this blog post on how I built a Neo4j educational platform on top of Neo4j. So you can kind of see that's the data model there. And I'll go into more detail about that. So basically the site itself is built on top of Neo4j, so it uses a Neo4j Aura database. So for the people that aren't aware of what Neo4j Aura is, it's our database as a service or managed cloud service. And the thing that I really like about this is you can create a database for free forever, without adding any credit card details or anything like that. So it's
it's super easy. You just need to log in with your email and create a password. So it's or use Google. So the entry level couldn't be any lower, I think. So you connect that and you get one free instance. So like you said, it's free forever. So you pick that. It has a little bit of a limitation. So it says here 200k nodes, 400k relationships. So that's still plenty, I think, for testing and for playing around with it. and you get that, and you can use Bloom, you can get you can use browser, you can connect remotely. So it's very powerful, very very feature rich, and it's you don't have to worry about updating as well. So I mean that's another point, right? You always have the latest Neo4j version running um, on your Aura, so it's not going to be old or whatever, and then all the stuff like, oh, I need to hotfix something because there's a vulnerability or whatever discovered. It's just easy for you. And it's free.
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, and so it takes away a lot of the headaches as well around like managing your Neo4j database, and it's all looked after by the experts as well, like by the people that have built the product itself. So there's not a better place to run it really.
Yep.
So yeah, you can start off with your own blank database, or you can start with one of the example data sets we've got here. So we've got a movies data set. So it's like people who've acted in movies or directed movies. Basically the same thing that the course is built around. We've got cybersecurity. I want to try it. I haven't actually looked at it yet, so I might actually create that and have a play around. So by the time, if anyone's watching this on playback, then this database will be gone by the time. So you don't have to worry about those credentials. They will be gone. Yeah. But yeah, so the website itself is built on Neo4j, which is really cool. And yeah, just basically allows us to eat our own dog food to a certain project. So does that quote, or does that saying, does that translate into German, or is there like a German equivalent of that? Because I've always wondered.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it sounds to me as a non-native, it sounds always like awful, because I imagine this disgusting bowl of glibber. So I don't want to eat that. But yeah, I don't even know if there is an equivalent of it in German. I don't think there is. There must be something like, but I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a vulgar saying though, right? Like it's not, like you say, it's not a nice one. Well, I remember listening to a podcast a while ago where they were talking about there was a like this vegan dog food company, and like everything is all completely plant-based and sustainable and etc. etc. But the problem they had is that the food didn't taste or smell bad enough to be appealing to dogs, so they had to they had to make it worse than it actually was in some way. That was their biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Anyway, I digress. Let's not talk about.
But yeah, I don't think there's a translation.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So looking at the data model itself, the data is kind of organized like this, and so the way that I like to approach these challenges is to write out like a set of problem statements. So for example, like a course is listed in a category, or a person enrolls to a course which is listed in a category. And then what you do is you take those sentences, and this is like this goes back to what they call ubiquitous language in domain-driven design. So basically, you use this when you're developing the software, you use the same language as the business uses, and then that means that there's no introduction of like tribal knowledge. When you're like there's no there's nothing that you need to know as a developer that isn't written into the use case from this application and then into the database itself. So through writing a list of all these things, this is what we came out with. But so a course is in one or more categories, and then so the first graphy thing you've got here is this the concept of a category which has child categories, and you have like this hierarchy. So we only go to 2 levels. but in theory, what you could do is have a huge like tree of categories, and then you could say, right, so start me off from this courses by experience, and then go all the way down through all of the has child relationships to any category, and then find me all of the courses in that category. So one of the things that I'm not sure if it's still the case, but I used to see quite a lot when I was working on like e-commerce platforms like 10 years ago or like whenever it was, like a long time ago, is that you would have to assign a product to the parent category and all of the children. And that's like, so either you like you could, for example, have that so the user has to check that all in the front end of the application, or when you click on the parent, it like ticks the sorry the child, or like the leaf node of the tree. Like it would have to cascade that up, or the actual application layer would do that cascading for you. But you add in like data to the database that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And then you're kind of like denormalizing this database, and it gets a bit of a mess. But in a graph database, what you can do is you could just create this hierarchy, and you can say, right, go through these relationships until I find something that I want. Like this, my pattern is to start at a category and then go through until I find a course that's connected to a category that belongs to it. So
Cool.
yeah, we have, and sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say before I have to jump off, maybe we answer two more questions that came in chat. Isa asks, what is your experience with the Svelte framework?
Okay. So I personally don't have a lot of experience with it, but so there are people inside Neo4j that swear by it. So it's kind of I guess it's the up and coming framework. But yeah, so I personally haven't got a lot of experience with it, but the the way that you would use Neo4j and you connect to Neo4j from Svelte would be exactly the same way as you would do through React or Vue or any JavaScript related project, and that's the Neo4j JavaScript driver. So you would create a single instance of the driver. So you create one instance of a driver per application, and then you would open up sessions, and then through those sessions, run Cypher queries, get results back, and then display them in the UI. So I suppose it's the same thing. It's just a different language and a different set of peculiarities, I guess. Like it's just a different way to then process the data, a different syntax to display that and convert that into HTML.
Okay, but it would just work like any other. So you can, if you're comfortable with using it or like using it, then you can just connect as if.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Exactly.
The other question is, and I'm not sure, maybe I'm missing a character here, or maybe you know, can I upgrade my existing m_db to Neo4j? I don't know what a m_db is, so I must admit.
Would it be MongoDB?
Maybe. I mean, upgrade is. I mean, I would like to say we upgrade from Mongo, but probably migrate is the correct term. And I'm not sure. Maybe you can specify which instance you mean, or what database that is. I don't know. If you imagine he meant Mongo, then yes, there are migration paths, and you can basically from any relational database. I mean, in essence, it's like we initially said load CSV is one of the paths, or use ETL tools like Kettle or Hop or something. You can go from your existing relational whatever no SQL database. You can go to graph. Yeah, relatively easy. I mean, it's used, it's done. It's a lot of people are doing that. So there are a couple of ways. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. So like one of the things that I touched on in the podcast was this well, I guess like where Neo4j would sit in your stack. And you can have Neo4j as your primary database and have other databases around it. You can have Neo4j as a secondary database where you have, say, for example, your whatever m_db is, or MongoDB, or whatever, as like a primary data store, and then you translate data into, or you take a view of the data into Neo4j to perform the graphy problems. So I don't know, you would have maybe have a store like a store architecture, like let's say like Amazon or whatever your favorite river is, a database with like the stock inventory in one place, and then maybe use Neo4j to route the packages to like through certain distribution centers until you get to the to the next point and like find the fastest route of discovery. So it's you can do that in many ways. Like you can either, so for example, you could use CSV. You could export to CSV file, and then use load CSV to import the data and use in Cypher. We have APOC, which is a library of procedures and functions, basically like your Swiss Army knife for Neo4j. And you can use things like JDBC connect. So any database that's got a JDBC connector, so MongoDB is an example of that. You can connect to it, run a query, and then get your results out, and then use Cypher to create the data from there. Or I mean, if you've got things like if you want to get complicated, you can do things like have a Kafka queue where you consume the data into all of your different databases at once, and then you can set up Neo4j as a sink, and then you can take the like import the data in directly from the queue from there. So that I guess it's like push, pull, or synchronize.
Yeah, lots of ways, lots of possibilities. It depends, again, unfortunately, what you want to do and what your infrastructure looks exactly, and whatever m_db is. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to say that anything is possible. You just need enough time to do it. But yeah, if there's if there's a specific use case, then we can walk through that, or I can answer any questions.
Okay, I'll have to jump because I have another meeting now. But this was fun, and obviously it continues. So don't go anywhere. I mean, I'll just leave. Have fun, everybody. Enjoy, and good luck with the rest of the stream, Adam.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Cool.
Bye.
Cool. Right. So if anybody has got any further questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I think I'll just jump on and go through the JavaScript course as a way to demonstrate like how we would use Neo4j with JavaScript or Node.js. Excellent. Cool. So I'm going to be brave here, and I'm going to delete my my current enrollment, and I'm going to try and do it again. And hopefully, I'll be able to do it in an hour or so. But we'll see how far we get with it. Cool. So I've authenticated. I'm now in my account. I'm going to delete my enrollment. Cool. So I am going to enroll in the course. So one of the things that the Graph Academy does when you enroll to certain courses, especially the development courses, is it will create you an instance of a Neo4j Sandbox database. So you don't need to install anything on your computer. You can just run Neo4j online. For anybody that isn't aware, so Neo4j Sandbox is a great way to start with Neo4j if you just got a if you're just curious and you want to play with a data set, you don't really know what you want to do, then you can go into to Sandbox and you can create one of these instances. So we have things like the OpenStreetMap data set is a great one for doing exploring paths, doing path finding, things like that. So you can use it to route yourself through Central Park in New York, which is pretty cool. You can look at network and IT management, do a crime investigation from Manchester, UK. Look at the women's 2019 World Cup. That might be interesting for people with the Euros going on at the moment. Take a look at cybersecurity, entity resolution. So there's some interesting stuff there. So what the Graph Academy course does is it creates a recommendations database for you, which you then use through the project. Cool. So I've enrolled. It's created that database for me in the background, and then firstly gives you some information about the projects in general, and then we can get on and start developing. So the first lesson is to set up the project. So I've already got Node installed, so I got 16.15.1 here. The project was written in 14.18, but will work in anything above that. And like I said, so there's a repository that you build on in order to complete this course. So it's under Neo4j Graph Academy on GitHub, and then the course is app Node.js. So the first thing you need to do is to clone this repository, and then we'll take a look at what is in there. Cool. So this is the course. So the first thing I'm going to do is just run npm install, and then that will give me all of the dependencies that I need. So if you take a look in package.json, so there's not a lot in there. So there's the API itself is built with Express. We use Passport to do the request authentication, and also use JWT in there, JWT tokens. The environment variables are loaded with the .env library, and then we have the Neo4j driver dependency in there as well. Cool. So I'm going to, so I've installed the dependencies there. Everything is good. So the next step is to copy the example environment file into the file itself. So I'll go through these settings as we need them. But we're basically running the app on port 4000. There's some Neo4j credentials, and then some stuff that you don't need to change. It's just there. So if I run npm start now, I should get API. here we are. So we've got this API running. So this is a fictional client called Neoflix, and it's a graph-powered movie recommendation site. So as we scroll down through the site, we can see we've got a list of popular movies here. These are, in theory, ordered by some sort of popularity score that we have. But then if we scroll down a little bit further, then we see that this is exactly the same set of movies. So obviously this is hard coded somewhere. So we'll go through and we'll update that. So again, if we look at the list of the people, as we load, it's only giving me a certain number of actors and actresses. If I look at the popular movies, it only gives me the same every time. So what we'll do is, as we go through and we set up the project, we'll go through and we'll update all of these calls to instead query Neo4j. Cool, brilliant. My project is running. I can click this project is running. We advance to the next lesson. Cool. So as I said, this creates a Neo4j Sandbox. So this lesson explains to you everything that you need to know about what an Neo4j Sandbox is. Then it gives you these credentials. So I can open up this browser at any time and then look through the database. So one thing you can also do inside Neo4j Graph Academy is if you click on this toggle sandbox button, then it gives you access to this sandbox, so you don't need to open this browser. You can just run the queries from there. Cool. So we've got some movies here. So we've got Toy Story there, which is an adventure, children's and fantasy and animation. Also comedy, which is what Waiting to Exhale is in. And then we can just kind of click through and open things up from here. So all of these kind of teal nodes are people that have rated the movie. I think there as well, we should have people that have acted in the movie as well. Cool. So this gives me some environment variables that I can copy in. So what we'll do is when we use the driver, we'll use a process.env to access these variables. We've got the Neo4j URI, username and password there. So I can just copy this straight into my env file. And now that I've done that, I now need to restart the process in order for those to be applied. Cool. So that's how we access these variables. So that's done. That's 2 challenges, quite easily done. On to the third. So what are we? Let's say 8 minutes. That's taken us in total. So next we learn a little bit about the driver. Cool. So I'm not going to read this verbosely. I'm just going to go through and tell you what you need to know. If you need to know more than this, then feel free to enroll to the course and carry through with the lesson. So when we connect to Neo4j for an application, we use what's called the Neo4j driver. So the driver is thread safe application wide fixture. So basically what you do is you create one instance of a Neo4j driver per application, then you can share that across your different modules and your different sites. So we create a single instance per cluster. So in order to save that, so you can use your favorite package manager. So we've got examples here for npm and yarn. So we use an npm here, so I can just run npm install Neo4j driver and then saves it to package.json. So it's already run, but let's run it again for the sake of it. Awesome. Cool. And then in order to create that instance, so by default, the driver exports this Neo4j object. That object then has a driver method on there, which allows you to create an instance of the driver. So this takes two arguments. So a connection string. So this is the connection to, in our case, the Neo4j Sandbox instance, and then an authentication token. So 99% of the time, it's going to be a basic authentication using username and password. And then once we create that instance of driver, we can use this verify connectivity function to verify that we've actually connected to the database and the credentials are correct. So the idea is that you want to fail early on this. So let's say we have a connection to a database which is incorrect. We don't want the application to start if those if the application can't connect to Neo4j. So I'm just going to answer these because so by the way, when you complete the course, you get a certificate, which you can share and you can use to impress your friends and family. Obviously, it's not the most important thing. So if we take a look at the code for creating a driver instance, so we take two arguments which we're going to need, and then the third one is an additional configuration. So I'm not going to cover configuration. It's things like modifying the size of the connection pool, default timeouts, things like that. But again, these are things that I haven't really used in sort of 5 years of working with Neo4j. So if you do need to know those, you can look in the documentation for that. So the first argument is this connection string. So this is formed up of certain pieces. So first thing we do is we have a scheme. So this is telling the driver how to connect to Neo4j. We specify an initial server address, which should be an address that the driver can connect to. We can tell it the port that it connects to, and we can also supply additional configuration details like a routing policy. So, for example, if you had applications all across the world, or if we had, like, for example, like edge functions, your edge function would live in a certain location, or your application server would live in a certain location. In theory, what you want to do there is you want to connect to a database which is as close to your application server as possible to cut down the amount of latency. So you can define that in the Neo4j configuration, and then define or connect to servers based on a certain policy. Neo4j will do its best to connect using that policy, or fall back just to anything. So in order to choose the scheme, broadly there's two things that we can look at, or two overarching things. So most likely you'll use some sort of variation of a Neo4j scheme to connect to the database. So for example, we have the Neo4j scheme, which creates an unencrypted connection to Neo4j. So this is good for local development. Wouldn't advise on using this in production. You can use Neo4j plus S to create a encrypted connection to Neo4j. And then what the driver will do is it will connect to the database, and it will check certificates, verify that certificate to make sure that that everything is correct on both ends. And then if you want to connect but not actually verify that certificate, then you can use Neo4j plus SSC. So if you've got a single instance for Neo4j, then you would just use one of these Neo4j ones, and there wouldn't be a problem. If you have a cluster, you can connect to your cluster. So connect to the initial member of your cluster. and then the routing table will be, this concept, this thing called the routing table will be held by the driver. So the driver is aware of every instance of Neo4j in your cluster, and then it will distribute out from there. If you want to connect directly to a single DBMS, then you'd use Bolt. And this, like for example, this would be useful if you had a cluster of databases, but you have like a single database there that you use for data science or for analytics, which maybe has like a greater memory capacity. So you can specify these to connect directly to there. If you're not sure, then you can check dbms.connector.bolt.enabled in the neo4j.conf file to see whether it's turned off or turned on. If you're connecting to an instance in Neo4j Aura, always Neo4j.s. Cool. And then the second thing you would need is a authentication token. So like I said, like 99% of the cases you would use a basic username and password. There's been probably once in 5 years of working for Neo4j that I've used something different. So there's this auth object which is exported by exported on the Neo4j object, which allows you to create a basic token using a username and password. And again, so this is what the additional configuration looks like. So you can do things like modify the max connection side, max connection pool size, connection timeout, and then we can create a logger or log to certain login library. Okay, so which connection is better, Neo4j plus S or Bolt? If you are connecting to a cluster of servers, it would be Neo4j or Neo4j plus S. The only time that you would ever use Bolt is if you're connecting to a specific machine. For example, for the case of analytics, or if you had a certain server in a certain location that you wanted to connect to run a test query on, then you would use that. So most of the time you'll be using Neo4j or a combination of Neo4j. Okay. So in order to check or understand, let's try this one through the chat. So can anyone ping through the answer to this question? So which of these following options are valid schemes to use in the connection string? So we've got Aura, Bolt, GraphDB, Neo4j, Neo4j plus S. I think there's a delay on the chat as well, so I'm not quite sure how well this is going to work, but let's give it a go anyway. Cool. Right, so the correct answers for this one are Bolt, Neo4j, and Neo4j plus S. So Aura and GraphDB don't exist. The scheme that you should use when connecting to a Neo4j Aura database is Neo4j plus S. Yeah, and yeah, points there for Peter there. Well done, Amit. Well done. Unfortunately, no, GraphDB isn't a valid one. All right. So if anyone is interested in coding along or doing this as well themselves, then feel free to head to graphacademy.neo4j.com, and then we can we can do it all together. You just have to skip the first couple of lessons. All right, so we're on to our first challenge, adding the driver to the project. So if we take a look in source and then Neo4j.js, we have this file which has a init driver function, get driver, and close driver. So these two act on driver if it exists. So we have this this driver value up here, and then we have this function here. So if we take a look in app.js, what happens is the this file will take the Neo4j Aura username and password, which are in our .m file, and then call init driver with those values. So we've got this to do here to create an instance of the driver. Cool. So our challenge here is to implement this function. So by opening source.neo4j.js, we create an instance of the driver. So first we need to install the dependency. So that's already done. We don't need to worry about that. We need to import that dependency into neo4j.js and then create a driver instance. So again, just for clarity, in order to install that, we do npm install neo4j driver. That'll go away and install that for us. So at the top of the file, we can replace this this to do, which is import the neo4j driver dependency. So we can say import neo4j from neo4j driver. And then this gives us access to this driver function. All right. Cool. So we can say in here, we'll assign it to this driver variable here, which is available throughout the whole whole module. So we can say driver is neo4j.driver. This takes these parameters I was talking about, this URL and the auth token. So the URL is the URI, which we've got passed through here, which is a string. And then the second argument is a authentication token. So if we do neo4j.auth.basic, and we pass through the username to that. So now we've got that instance of the driver. What we can do is we can verify the connectivity. So we can call driver.verify. And so this returns a promise. To verify connectivity, like optionally, we can pass a database now as well if we're using a multi-database setup. And this gives us then server info. So what we can say is if we return driver.verify connectivity, then we can return that driver instance once everything is okay. If the connection doesn't work for whatever reason, then an error will be thrown, and then we can stop the application from starting. Brilliant. So we've done that. We've created the driver instance. And now, so with these challenges, you will need to run a test in order to pass the challenge. So this one runs challenge 1. So we can find these under tests and then challenges. So 1, connect to Neo4j. So what this will do is it will first create a driver instance and connect to the server. So it expects the URI, username, and password to be defined in .env. And then, well, so in this sorry, yeah, in process.env. It'll then check that the once this code has been run, that driver instance is instantiated and then assigned to that driver value. And then we'll test that the connector has successfully connected to Neo4j. So if I run npm run test 01. Those 3 runs. So we've test suites have passed 3. 1. 3 tests have passed. And all is looking good in our code. So if I shut this one, this is going to bug me. We take a look here. So how many tests will run in npm test 01 commands? So 3. Perfect. So we've now passed that challenge. So if you do get stuck at any point here, there's this "Are you stuck?" page, and what you can do is you can check out a particular branch if you get stuck, and then see what's going on. Most of the pages also have the correct solution that you can go and copy as well. All right, brilliant. So that's what, 20 minutes, and we passed two lessons. Again, if anyone has any questions, any comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll answer them as soon as I notice that they're there. Awesome. So next, on to interacting with Neo4j. Great. So we have this this instance of the driver in our application. What we do through there is we create sessions, and then through sessions we can then create transactions and run Cypher queries against the database. So when we talk about a session, it's not the same as an actual connection to the database. So when you run a Cypher query through the driver, we use a protocol called Bolt to send the query, and then a set of parameters, and then bring back a result. So that is done by multiple TCP connections. Those connections are established by the driver and then put into what's called a connection pool. And then that connection pool, those connections are borrowed from that connection pool by a session. The session is just the client-side abstraction, which means you don't have to worry about managing those connections. To open a new session, we call the session method on the driver. We can also supply additional arguments there. So we can say, well, like, what's the default access mode? So it's read by default, but you can set it to be write. And then we can also specify like a database to connect to as well. So if we have multiple databases on our DBMS, then we can specify there. So you don't specify the database that you query at driver level. You do that at session level. And then if nothing is supplied as a database, then it falls back to the default database. So by default, that's Neo4j. You can set that in neo4j.conf by setting dbms.default database. Cool. And in this piece of code, even though we've set the default access mode to write, that can be overwritten by calling read transaction when you actually run the query. And then through a session, we can create and run one or more transactions. So Neo4j is an ACID compliant database. So ACID means that any transaction or any operation that happens on the database needs to be atomic. So it can't be affected by anything else. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be isolated from everything else. It needs to be durable. So once you save the data to the database, it can't disappear for any reason. If a server goes down inside the database, your data is still sorry. If your server goes down within a cluster, then your data is still there and still safe. So there are 3 types of transactions that we can use inside the driver. So we have auto commit transactions, read transactions, and write transactions. So an auto commit transaction, you automatically fire off a query and then or create a transaction, fire off the query, and then commit that transaction straight away. So this is the easiest way to do it. But as this block here states, these should only be used in testing periods, or if you like running a query once. If you write an application, then you shouldn't use these. Cool. So we have this this concept of a transient error in Neo4j. So basically, like a transient error is something that happens that can be maybe fixed by retrying or doing something. Or without changing your query. The problem is with the connection itself. So say, for example, we have a inside our drive, we have a routing table. We're aware of 3 servers. One of those servers is unavailable for whatever reason. The driver tries to query that database. When you use session.run, it won't try and retry that on another database in the cluster. Whereas when you use read and write transactions, it will use those again. Cool. So when you intend to read data from Neo4j, what you can do is you can execute a read transaction. And in it, so in a clustered environment in Neo4j or in Neo4j Aura, for example, these read queries are distributed across the cluster. So you don't put too much load on one server. These are distributed out. So against that session, we can call the read transaction method. So this expects a single parameter, which is like a callback function. That function represents the unit of work or what you want to do inside that transaction. So that gives you a transaction object, which you can then run a Cypher code with using tx.run. So in this case, I am running a query to find all of the people nodes that have acted in a movie, where the title is this title parameter. So in this case, Arthur. And then return the name of the person, or name property of the person nodes, and then limit that to 10 results. So like I say, so we send parameterized queries through to Neo4j. So we have inside this query, anything that starts with $, that means this is a parameter that I've sent through with the query. In this case, this title represents the title. Pass-through is the second argument, and this means that there's no way that you can like do Cypher injection. So think of like SQL injection, the same sort of thing. Like if I put a closed speech mark in there and then semicolon match end attached to the end, that could in theory delete everything. So this means that you don't have to worry about that. Cool. So if you want to write to the database, it's almost identical. So instead of calling read transaction, you call write transaction. And again, you then call tx.run on the value passed to the function, to the unit of work. And again, so I'm saying create a person node with a name of Michael. So if anything goes wrong with this unit of work, well, there's a problem on the Neo4j side itself. A write transaction will automatically be rolled back, and it will be committed automatically committed at the end of this this write transaction. You can also create a manual transaction, so we can call session.begin transaction, and then it gives you this transaction object. Through that, you can keep running tx.run as long as you want, or as many times as you want. But then the drawback is you have to explicitly commit this transaction by calling tx.commit at the end, or roll back if something has gone wrong. Then once you're finished with your session, you can call close on that, and then that releases any of the underlying TCP connections to the database back into the pool, so it can be can be used from there. So we take a look at this working example. So we've got an async function here, which is intended to create a person, and we supply the name of that person. So the first thing we do is we create a session on the people database with the default access mode of write. We then use session.write transaction to execute a write Cypher statement against Neo4j. So this write transaction method takes a function. That function has a single parameter, which is tx, which is our transaction object. And against the transaction, we can run the run function, running a Cypher query. So in this case, create a person node with a name property of name, and then return that node. We then get the p value from that first record, and then return the properties of that after we've closed the session. Okay, so quiz time. So which of the following options are valid methods for running a read query through Neo4j? So there's 1 session.run, 2 session.query, 3 session.read, and then 4 session.read transaction. Come on, chat, don't let me down. Okay, so the valid things we can do is we can run session.run, although we shouldn't, in a production environment, or we can use session.read transaction. So reading from the database, say we want to create a new transaction that reads data from Neo4j, we would use session.read transaction. And if we want to write to the database, then we use write transaction. Okay. Brilliant. So next is processing results. So there's 2 ways through the JavaScript driver that we can process results. So we can either use the promise API, which is what we use through this project, or we can use the streaming API. So when you call session.run or tx.run, or read transaction, write transaction, the query will return a promise. So we can await the value of that, or we can use promises, and we can use the then function and then chain up from there. So in this case, we've got so we're saying run this query in a read transaction. Then once we have the results, the result returns a record array, which you can interact with like any JavaScript array. So in this case, we're using the through every row, we are getting a row object, and then we're console logging those out. So this result object, so what is res above, contains information on the records. So this is the actual information that gets returned from Neo4j, so like an individual row. So you can access the values inside that row by either supplying the name or the alias of the value that you've returned, or you can use an index as well. So a zero, they call it zero-based index for the values. And we get a results summary. So this is information about the query itself. So for example, when the first result was available, so in this case, like 10 milliseconds, and then when the final result was consumed. So in this case, 30 seconds. For a write query, we can get counters as well. So we can get like the amount of information which is like touched, or the amount of elements in the graph that are touched or affected by this query. So in this case, we've got like 10 nodes created. We've created 5 relationships, set 20 properties. Cool. The other option is the streaming API. So the drawback to having the promise API is that the results only become available once the query is finished, which might be fine for most cases, but there may be a case where, say, for example, you have a long-running query, you want to update the front end of the website as the results come in, rather than by once everything is complete. So the example I've got here is like, a flight website. So like with Skyscanner, for example, they show you the best results as they have them, and then they update the UI as more results come in. So in this case, there's a subscribe method that you can use. To this, you supply an object with a set of callbacks. So here we have this subscribe with this object. When the keys of the results become available, then this onKeys is called. So in this case, we're returning one value, which is the name. So that's our one key that's available. OnNext is called every time a record becomes available. So in this case, this is returning Alice as the first record. And then you could, like, for example, use this to push the values to your front end using WebSockets or something like that. I don't know. Once the query is completed, then you can, like, I don't know, shut the connection down or do whatever you need to do, commit the transaction in another database. But you get the summary, so you can check the counters and stuff like that. And if anything goes wrong at any point, then you have this on error, which you can then use for error handling. So there's also you can also use RxJS to consume results. So instead of creating a session, you create an Rx session, and then you use that Rx session to again to run read or write transactions, and then through there you take the records and you pipe them through to your operators. So in this case, we're using the map operator to get the name value from the record. Cool. So I think I'll take this one, but the drawback of using the Promise API is the fact that the results are only available once you've received the final record. So if you've got a slow running query, then your user might be waiting a long time for that. Okay. Cool. I'm not going to go through all this. There's one caveat, like I mentioned, on integers. But if you are interested, then either check out the documentation or check out the course. But this is how all of the values get mapped to Neo4j. So the one major gotcha that you've got when you're using JavaScript with Neo4j. So the J in Neo4j stands for Java. So everything is a Java type. So Java uses a 64-bit integer, whereas JavaScript only uses 32-bit integers. So in order for the data to not be lost, the driver provides this an integer type and then like an int function for using integers in Neo4j. So we have this this int function, and basically what it does is it splits it into a high and low, which allows it to be kind of the 64-bit value. The isInt function allows you to check whether a value is an integer, and then you can convert that back to a number into a JavaScript native number by calling toNumber. So if it's too high or it's outside of this range, so in between the min and max safe integer, then it will return it as a string rather than a number, so you don't really lose anything. All right. Great. Okay, so let's write some code. There's hope. So, I guess the majority of the theory is out of our way now. But basically, so when you so if you do this course, or if you're running queries through Neo4j, then you basically do this thing like over and over again. First thing you do is you open a session, then you execute a Cypher statement, you manipulate the results, close the session, and then return the results. Right, so if we take a look at the home page, so these two values here, popular movies and latest releases are exactly the same. So let's jump into the code and let's take a look at why that might be happening. All right, so if we take a look in the movie route, so this is the route handlers that are registered with Express. So when we call get /API/movies, if we get this this list of movies there. So we've got, what's this one? Shawshank Redemption, Godfather Part 2, and so the API will so the front end will pass to the API like a set of values for pagination. So the limit, the skip. So if I put like limit to be 1, this should still be applied. Okay, so it's ignore that. But that's good. So yeah, so we get this information which is used to reorder the results by these values. So if we take a look in the code, so we've got sort order, limit, and skip. So these are extracted from the request using a helper function. Next thing that happens is there's an instance of the movie service is created, and then passed through is the driver that we've created in the first challenge. So from Neo4j.js, this guy here gets passed through. Then the all method is called on that movie service with these values, and then the JSON response is returned. So if we take a look in that movie service, the constructor takes one argument, which is the Neo4j driver, and then assigns it up here. And then this all method, so this method should return a paginated list of movies ordered by the sort parameter and limited to the number of passed in the limit. The skip variable should be used to skip a certain number of rows. There's also this user ID, but we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But we can see inside this all method, there's a load of to-dos, and then we're returning this popular thing, which is, so this is exactly what we've just seen from the API call. So what we want to do is to cool. So let's take the first to do. The first thing we do is we open a session. So we've got that that driver object. We can call session on that, and then that gives us our value. We then want to execute a query inside a read transaction. So inside the lesson itself, you can get the query or the exact result. Also in the code base, what you can do is inside this Neflix Cypher, there is so split out by the lesson that you're on. So in this case, it's 2 interacting and then 4 homepage. can get the query from here. So this is basically what's happening there. We're finding a movie where the title is not null, in this case, returning so the properties of the movie with an alias of the movie ordered by the title in ascending order. Cool. So what we do in this second to do, is we want to run a transaction. So we can call that res. And we want, so the retransaction returns a promise. So we just need to await that to get the results out. So like I say, in this this retransaction, we supply a function which expects a single argument. And we can say tx.run. And we're running some sort of Cypher query. And we have a list of parameters there, or objects of parameters. Right. Cool. So if we take that movie list cipher, and then paste that in. So one thing that we need to do in Neo4j is sort out the dynamic ordering. So this is one thing that you can't pass through as a parameter. Otherwise, it won't use indexes when it's querying Neo4j. So what we have to do is inside backticks is use that sort value. So where that value is not null, so Neo4j will order nulls first. So this is just saying ignore anything that doesn't have a title. And we can order by that value. And then what we want to do is as parameters, we can fill out these values here. So we can pass the skip. We can pass the limit there. We also want to take the order and then add that into the query. Cool. So if I just take that and then I just log that out, and we can see what's happening. So if I refresh the home page, we have an Neo4j error. Argument error. I tell you what, I've never actually seen this before. Invalid status code. So this is the query that's being run. So we've got match movie where the IMDb rating is not null. Return the properties of the movie as a movie, ordered by m.imdb rating in descending order. Which is good. Cool. And that's we'll check that those. So that looks like that's a problem with the credentials. So let's have a quick look at the test again. So it's creating an instance and then connects to the server, which is okay. I said don't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So it's okay for like one-off statements. Console.log res.records row.get. Just going to run that in the background. Yeah, so that's fine. So that's running. So this is the integer with the low and the high. Action's okay. Let's try that again. Oh, this is an express error. Oh no, it's is it that? Roots, movies. Let's return the same thing. So this is the joys of live coding, right? Okay, so we've got the result there. So the movies that we want, we need to extract that from res. So we can say res.records.map row.get movie. So that applies to that alias there. And we want to close the session. So wait session.close. And we want to return those movies out. Oh, limits. Okay, so skip and limit. This is saying that these both need to be a valid value, so a non-negative integer. So what we need to do here is we need to convert those to an integer. So if I use the int function supported by Neo4j, and that will convert those over. Good. By JavaScript. And right, we've got movies. So we've got the first one there in descending order. So in theory, this is the latest release. So if I order this by the IMDb rating, you get the highest one in the database, which is Band of Brothers. And so another thing to point out at this point, so we see that we've got this year, we've got the high and the low, runtime, IMDb votes. So this is because these are stored as integers in the database. So what we need to do is to convert the values out of a Neo4j integer back into a JavaScript integer. So one of the things that I have done is in this project is in this utils file, I've created a toNative types function. And what this does is just an iterative process goes through everything that's returned from a Neo4j object or Neo4j result and converts it back into a JavaScript value. So we've got, if it's an array, then it just runs a map on this to then convert everything back into that value again. If it's an integer, so again using this isInt function, converts that to back to a number. If it's a date, then it converts it to a string, and then goes from there. So what I can do is say convert toNative types. And this, save that, and then if we keep an eye on the year, that's now back to an integer. So when you convert things, or so when you send things over to Neo4j that are a JavaScript integer, you have to convert those, and you have to convert them back out when they come back out of Neo4j. Okay, so if we set the limit to be 2, we've now got 2. Then if I refresh this page now, I should get the movies. But they are not shown in the UI. The joys of live code, no? While I'm trying to debug this, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop in the comments, and then we will I will answer them as soon as I notice them. Okay. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm happy that that's working. So, oh, there we go. That's what we want. Up there instead. All right, here we go. Right, so right. So what happened there was I was converting the value here. There must be a bug in that function. But instead of calling it the toNative types here, which was converting it back into an object by the looks of it, I've done it up here in the actual consuming of the results to convert that movie value out. It's now a JavaScript array returned by the API rather than an object with the values. So yeah, cool. Right, so this, if we scroll a little bit further down, then in order to verify that we've completed this challenge, the lesson would like to know what is the highest by IMDb rating. So we can find that through this query. So we can order in IMDb rating in descending order. So the values there is Band of Brothers. But again, because it's a challenge, there's another test there. So if I create a new terminal window, I can run npm run test02. Run through, verify that everything that I've done so far is correct. Then gives me some console logs. So here's the answer to the quiz question from the lesson. What is the title of the highest rated movie in the recommendations data set? Copy and paste the value below, Band of Brothers. So if I put that into the UI, then we pass the lesson. Cool. We are motoring. Okay, so we've read from the database. Let's write to the database. Cool. So we do the same thing again. So instead of running a read transaction, we again run a write transaction. We extract some stuff from the result, close the session, return the results. So if we take a look at the website, firstly, so there's this register link at the top of the page. So I can put in my name, I can put in an email address, and then a password. And so when I do that, if we open up the network tab, we can see this HTTP request to API/auth/register. It's returned a 422 error and unprocessable entity, and is telling me that the email address is taken. So an account already exists with the email address at neo4j.com. So if we take a look in the auth routes, we can see that the on the post to /register, which is the API response we've called, it creates a new instance of the auth service, again passing through the Neo4j driver, and then calls the register method before returning the output. If there's an error thrown, then it sends that through to some error handling middleware. But if we take a look in this register method now, right, so if the email address isn't adam@neo4j.com, then throw a validation error saying the account already exists. So you should recognize that from the that message from the UI. So if we go in and we change this to be graphacademy@neo4j.com, cool, like it's worked. It's logged us in, and then returned the information on the user, which is not necessarily what we want there. So there's some to-dos in here. The first thing to do right now is to save the user. So the first thing we do is we will create a session again. So session is driver.session. And then within that session, we want to run a write transaction. So result is await session dot write transaction. So again, this takes a single argument, which is a method to return to represent our unit of work. That has a single parameter, and then we return tx.run. We run a Cypher statement, and then send through a set of parameters. So if we take a look in the Cypher folder again, so under registering, well, we don't have the method, the Cypher there. So note to self, I have to go and update that. But I will go to the lesson, and then it gives me the Cypher creator runs from running a create statement, creating a node with a label of user, creating a user ID, which is random UID, So if we run that in Sandbox, it gives me a 4-part UUID, so just a unique ID for that user. And then in this case, it's taken the email, the encrypted password, and the name from the objective parameters. Fix that in. Cool. And then, so when the object is returned, this token value is supplied to as well as part of the request. So this is what's called a JWT token. So if you don't know what one of these is, it's a basically encrypted yeah, so it's basically a way of authenticating. So you create a set of claims, which would be this string here. You give it a you sign it with a private key and then add that to the token, and then you can assure that when you try and decode that token, if the signature matches the value, then yeah, it's wrong with that token. But if it matches that value, then you can assure that it's been signed by your server or by your application. So this is already done here. So we've got using the JWT library to sign a payload, which is basically a set of claims that you say about the user, and then sign it with this JWT secret, which comes from the .m file. So all we need to do is to pull that information from this value instead. So we take the email address, name, and the user ID, and then put those into the claim. So we have this res object. So what I can do is I can use like array destruction to say that the user value is res.records. So then that assigns the so this user variable then becomes the first value in that records array. So because we're returning a user node here rather than just like properties, then I can add the properties there. So then when we're destructuring the properties to get the password and then everything else that we want to put into the claim. So we never send even an encrypted password back to the user as part of that JWT token. Cool. And then again, we need to close the session. And that should be good to go. So this one is a challenge that's got a test as well. I run npm run test 03. It's my fingers. This should pass. Can't destructure property password of user.properties as it is undefined. All right, cool. So if I see what we're getting there and then bug from there. Right, so record has Oh, yeah, no, like this. So, right, we need the first one, and then the user is first.get you. Yeah, because I didn't actually extract the value there, so that makes sense. Okay, let's save that. So again, here we are. So now, instead of a record, I've now got that node. So this is the internal ID of the user. This is the labels that he gets, and these are the properties. So this is a node object, and then when I use the destructuring on user.properties, I then get that. Okay. Right, so now if I go back to the UI and I register, and I say use another email address that isn't just graphacademy at neo4j.com, register. Ooh, hang on. Right. Take that out. Run that again. And then, hey, Adam, we signed in. So we take a look at that register call again. Then we have so an email address, a name, this JWT token, which if I try and decode that now, so now we've got the sub, which is the subject of the token. So this refers to, in this case, it's the user ID. We have the user ID property, the name, and then the issued at time. So if I go back into the lesson and then I try and find this user, and sorry, user ID, and here it is. So this is this node that we just created. So we've got an email address there, adam@neo4j.com. Name is Adams. The password is encrypted using bcrypt. And then that user ID is that random UUID that was used to generate the user. All right. Cool. So another thing that test does when you run it is it creates a user in the database. So it creates a new user called Graph Academy with an email address, graphacademy at neo4j.com. So if I check for that, we should see a user there. And then, so by clicking check database, it will check that there is a user node, which we have here with a email address of graphacademy.neo4j.com, the name Graph Academy, and the password to be encrypted. So I check database there. It will go away, and we've done it. Perfect. So we have read from the database and we've written to the database. Ooh, deep breaths. Right. Are there any questions at this point? Anything that I've done here? Feel free to shout out. Add it to the comments. If not, we'll take a look at handling driver errors. So far we've assumed that everything is fine and nothing's ever going to go wrong. But that's not always the case. Sometimes things will go wrong with your Cypher queries, whether it's a problem with the actual query that you've written or the database that you're running it on, or DBMS that you're running it on, right? So when Neo4j returns an error, it returns error code, so the standardized code format, which looks a little bit like this. So we have Neo, always starts with Neo, dot, the classification of the error, the category that it sits in, and then the title. So the classification is a high-level classification. For example, like a client-side error, server-side error, something like that. The category of the error. So, for example, is there a problem with the database? Is there a problem with the schema? Does the user have the correct permissions? And then a title gives you more specific information. So here's a list of some of the common ones that I've come across. So we've got, for example, like a unauthorized error. So neo.client error.security.unauthorized. The authentication has failed, so we can't run that query against the database. I've put a typo in my query. So neo.client error.statement.syntax error. This statement contains invalid or unsupported syntax. So there's a whole status code document on the in the Neo4j docs, which tells you every single one and what that means and steps to fix those. So we can catch those errors either in async await functions or in a promise. So in async await, async await, not await, await. In async await, we've got async await. In async await, we have a try block and a catch block. So we try to run something in the try block. We await the results. If anything goes wrong, then we catch the error. The error object has a code property against it, which we can use to get the code, which is what we had above. And then, as with any JavaScript error, the message is there to give you better idea of what's going on. If we do that in promises, then we catch the error inside the catch function before finally closing that session. Okay, so quiz time. What property is appended to the Neo4j error to give a generic overview of the error message? It's the code, right? And what property can we examine to find detailed information about any error that's thrown by the driver? So that is, as with every standard standard JavaScript error, that's the message. All right, so let's try and do this now in the try catch block. So in the previous challenge, what we did is we updated the register method to save that user in the database. There's still one to do in that file, which is to handle the unique constraints for the error. So previously, it was just checking for if the user wasn't graphacademy.neo4j.com, and it would throw that error. But what we want to do is instead put the responsibility of checking for that unique user onto the database itself. Somebody tries to write to the database from another application that isn't this one, then we can still handle that error, and we can ensure that there's only one user with each email address. So again, what we do is we use or wrap everything in a try catch block. We want to try to create the user, and then if anything goes wrong, then we want to handle that error. So in the case of a unique constraint error, so if the error that's thrown by Neo4j bubbles up to the surface, then it will return a 500 error, which is not really what we want. What we want is like a standardized error that helps the user to use the site. So when an error is thrown, it gets caught in this catch block, which goes through to the next function. And then we have an error handling middleware, which will check the status of the code, or 500, and then return the JSON with the information from that. So when we create the this constraint here, the code and the details are attached to the error, and then the middleware can then interpret that. So we just want to do this basically is and check if that's if that error is if it's a generic Neo4j error, then that's fair enough. Then, or if it's some sort of error, syntax error, some sort of problem with the Node application itself, then that's fair enough for that being a 500 error. But if it is a constraint error, then what we want to do is handle that in the code and then reflect that in the UI. Cool. So we want to create the user. So we would copy all of this into the try block. And then return the properties. If something goes wrong, then we can check the error code. If the error, then we want to throw a different error. All right. Otherwise, we just throw the same error out again, and then it'll bubble through to the surface. So the first thing that we need to do inside the lesson is first to create this unique constraint. So this constraint, if it doesn't exist, will be created. We've given it a name of user email unique. On the user node, or any node with a label of user, to assert that the email property is unique. So if I do show constraints, see there that I've got this user email unique, and there's some other ones for like user IDs and movie IDs and things like that. So now if I try to create a user with an email address of graphacademy@neo4j.com, now get this error. So the error code is neo.clienterror.schema.constraint validation failed, and then this is the message that we'll get against the error. So what we want to say is if that code is equal to this, and throw that error. Otherwise, just carry on with whatever whatever error you had in the first place. Before finally releasing any resources that we've got there. Excellent. So in order to verify that we've written our code properly, we can run this test 4. And all things going well. We have one test suite pass with 2 tests in there. The unique constraint exists in our database, and a validation error is thrown when the email already exists in the database, which is exactly what we wanted. So now if I click check database there, that should just go away in the background, find the constraint, find the user, and job done. All right. So that is reading to the database, writing to the database, and handling errors. So the next few lessons are basically doing the same thing. So authenticating a user is basically going through. Have we got enough time for this? Actually, 2.5 hours, 4 o'clock. Again, if you've got any errors, feel free to put any errors. If you've got any questions, or if you have got any errors, if there's any questions, then feel free to stick them in the comments. Part of me wants to complete this whole course in like 2 hours. Let's go for it. Let's go for it. Right. So authenticating user. So again, we do the same thing. So in the auth service, there is a authenticate method. So right now, this is just hard coded to say if the email is graphacademy.neo4j.com and the password that you send through is let me in, then it lets the user in. Otherwise, it will return false. So if it returns true or returns something, then that's the user, or results are false when the user is not found or the ID is sorry, the password is incorrect. Cool. So again, if I just comment all this out a moment. So again, the first thing we do is create a session, open a new session. So drive.session. And we want to get some results. So we do session read transaction against that TX objects that's passed through. And just go ahead and call it straight away, tx.run. So what I want to do is here is just find the user in the database. So find the user where the email is equal to the email that's passed through to the function. So we'll pass that as a parameter. And then we just want to return the user in this case. Good. So if res.record sort of length is 0, so if no results are found inside Neo4j, we just return false. So the user isn't found at that point. Then we need to check that the passwords are equal to each other. So for that, we use bcrypt, which should already be. Yeah, so we've got this compare function from bcrypt, which given some raw data, will check that against the encrypted value. So we want to get the encrypted password. So let's first get the user. Record 0 is the first record. Get you. So the encrypted password is user.properties.password. So we can use compare function to compare this is the unencrypted password that was passed through to the method with the encrypted password. And let's say if that's not true, then we'll return false. So if we get to this point, user is found and the password. Okay, so then we can start to return the information about the user. So we can use the same method that we've used here. So firstly, we close the session because we want to release those resources. We then extract out the user, use the safe properties from user.properties, use that to sign the token, and then off we go from there. So I created a user in the UI, which was adam@neo4j.com. I think the password was 1234. If I try and sign in now, that's not correct. Network error. That's not a good sign. What have we done wrong? res.records.length. Oh, I have to wait it because it returns a promise. So that should be good now. So if I run that again, okay, let me in. Cool. Okay. I don't think that was supposed to happen. Right. Let's create a new user. Password neo4j.com. Password. So this shouldn't let them in, but it does. Oh. It's need to await that value. So if I just try that again. So the compare returns a promise, which is why that was letting the user in. The promise will always be true. Right, so if I now do password at neo4j.com, incorrect password, cool. Request failed with status code 401. But if I do password, that lets me in. Brilliant. Okay, so now if I run the next test, fingers crossed this all passes. And great, so I've got authenticated a recently created user, return false and incorrect username, incorrect password. And then what it does is it sets a timestamp against a user in the sandbox. So now, if I go and click the verify button, there will be a user in there with the email of authenticated@neo4j.com and a it was last seen at or authenticated at. There'll be a timestamp set against that. Lesson passed, job done, which is great. Brilliant. And then the next challenge is all about integers. So hey, Bruce Wayne, I'm sure that's your real name. So question here. I'm using Neo4j for with Node.js for a Twitter-like use case. How would you validate many relationships? For example, I wanted to validate that all users mentioned in a tweet are followers and following. So one thing you can do with a Neo4j Sandbox, which is quite nice, is if you in with a Twitter account, then you can import in your. Okay. You might have to trust me on this one, but you can import in your own tweets and your own network into Neo4j. So let's just see if I can get this email quickly. Okay, let's go down the arrows route. So we mentioned, if anyone that's been on for the whole 2.5 hours, then we mentioned arrays a little bit earlier. So this is what arrays is. So it's a way of drawing out graphs on the screen. So what you can do is you can through a UI start to build out your graph. So I can say that this is me. So I give it a caption, but that's just like a let's just say that Adam has posted a tweet. That tweet mentions Neo4j, and it also mentions Bruce. What we can do is we can start to kind of flesh this out and draw it out. We can customize like colors and stuff, and we can start to play around with that. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but what we can do is say, like, for example, this node would be a user, so like a Twitter user or an account. We can apply it to these two as well. One user for those. And we could say that this is a labeled tweet. So my name is so this is my my user. My username on Twitter is Adam Cowley. And then maybe I don't know, signed up on I don't know, 1st of January. So I posted this tweet. So maybe this has a text would be something like, "Wow, check it out, Bruce Wayne. I'm modeling Neo4j using #arrows." So we'd have like a model that a little bit like this. So like a user tweeted the tweet. So this is a user, and then the username there will be, I don't know what your Twitter is or whatever, like Bruce Wayne 1234. And then this one was Neo4j. So on that tweet, you've also got this hashtag as well. So we could say like, take a node in there with the label is hashtag, and then the text is arrows. So we could say that this tweet mentions Bruce Wayne and also mentions Neo4j. So the question was, how would you validate many relationships? For example, I want to validate that all users mentioned in the tweet are followers or following, right? So we could say say we've got so Neo4j follows me, I follow Neo4j. But then we have this Bruce Wayne user over here that doesn't follow me. What I can do with this is I can import this into a database by clicking the download export button. So it gives you a few options. So you can download the graphic itself, or you can take the Cypher and then you can copy that into a file and share it with somebody. I can just run in the Neo4j browser, which is pretty cool. Where's it gone? Cool, but what I'm going to do is copy that. And then put that into my database. So I'm just going to create a new database. Right, so I've got this tweet in here now. So wow, check it out, Bruce Wayne 1234, modeling Neo4j using arrows. So we've got a mention of this hashtag. We've got this user which tweeted it, and then we've got the user mentions or follows. So I could say, for example, like find me, so from the user with the username Cowley, give me or find me all of their tweets. And then we want the mention. So I could say that with the tweet, and then original user. So give me all of the people that this tweet mentions. So tweet mentions U2. Now I've got the let's put it out in a bit of a nicer format. So we say no, that's fine. Let's carry on with that. So we've got this. We've got the tweet node there. We've got the users as an array. So we've got 1 and 2 there. So let's say we'll return tweet, and then let's say return m dot username as mentions. Ooh, that should be U2. So the tweet mentions Neo4j and Bruce Wayne. And then what you could do is just say like for all mention in the mentions. So from for every value inside that mentions, give it an alias of m. Then you could say where m follows t. Username there. So the followers mentioned. Oh, sorry. It's you. So if we check back on that graph again, we've got so this user, which would be you, tweeted a tweet where it mentions Bruce Wayne and Neo4j. So Neo4j follows this original U count, but Bruce Wayne doesn't. So in our result set, we have the users mentioned, Neo4j and Bruce Wayne. The followers of the Adam Cowley node that are mentioned is just Neo4j. So we can basically using the relationships and the structure of the graph to find that information out. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, like, feel free to post a follow up. Happy to go on that. We'll go a little bit further down. What's my favorite JavaScript feature? I don't know. So actually, not my favorite things are probably destructuring, and also the fact that with like the latest the later versions of Neo4j, you can just do the latest versions of JavaScript. You can do like this dot something. If that something is defined, then is it called the Alvis operator? So you can just do you can use that rather than being like if this dot something and this dot something dot else. But I think that's probably my favorite thing. I mean, I don't know if that's the answer that you were looking for. But I think I quite like that. What's your favorite JavaScript feature? Maybe I need some inspiration on answering this question. So yeah, everybody that's watching, everyone that's watching it hasn't fallen asleep, I suppose. Put your favorite JavaScript feature in the comments. I'm quite interested to see what they are. Awesome, but cool. Thanks for the question. All right. So I've got to drop off this in 40 minutes. So I'm wondering whether I can. That's what I didn't want. I'm wondering whether I can go through these. These finished. Okay, so rating the movies is the next one. So basically, on each one of the review pages, when you're logged in, you get this drop down. You can set the value between 1 and 5 and click rate. That sends through a post request to API accounts, ratings, and then the movie ID. In the account routes, it creates an instance of the rating service. The add method is then called on that. Yeah, the rating. The add method is called on there with the user ID. So that's decoded and taken from the token. We've got the ID of the movie and then the rating. So I use the parseInt function to convert the value that will be a string from the payload into that value. So yeah, so pass that into an integer and then do some magic Neo4j stuff in here. So there's some to-dos in here. Let's work through these. So we could say the Neo4j integer rating is int rating. I don't know if you'd call it that, but we need to import that from the Neo4j driver. Now gives us a Neo4j integer. Then want to save that into the database. So saving data to the database, we use the write transaction. So first thing we need to do is open a session. This .driver.session. Res is await session transaction, and then we want to run this query with these values: user ID, movie ID, rating. Find the movie where the TMDB ID, this guy up here, is the movie ID. We want to find the user where the user ID is the user ID. So we can use the merge statement to either find or create a relationship between the user node and the movie node, so we don't get duplicates there. And if that user exists, if that exists, then just update the property. Otherwise, create it and then set the property. So we can say merge user rated movie. I think that is that there. Yeah. So and then assign that to R, and then we can say set R dot rating. And then we can return keys of the movie. And we can also say that this is now favorite of the user. So in the UI, so now that once I'm logged in, password at neo4j.com, password, logged in as this new user. When I hover over any of these movie cards now, I get this this bookmark icon. So by clicking that, it will add it to my favorites, and then if I remove it, then I click again, then it removes it. So it all gets added to this favorite list, which again, this is hard coded at the moment. But in theory, when I click that, it will remove it, or I can add it in. So that's what that favorite flag does, is either adds that that flag there or doesn't. Cool. So I can say that the movie is res.records0.get movie. So that's from the first row, give me this value. And then I can return two native types. Cool, brilliant. So now I run test 6 to make sure that my code is good. Cross my fingers. Should store movies as an int. Right, so what is that doing? So should store the rating as an int. Have I got the... okay, so we have to return the rating. Up a little bit. All right, so our test is passed. One test is passed successfully. So now in the database, there should be a new user created called Graph Academy Reviewer. It's given Goodfellas a rating of 5. If I hit that, perfect. So we now saved the relationship between the user and the movie to represent that rating. Awesome. Cool. So response back from Hey Bruce again. So amazing, thank you. You won't be able to detect which mentioned user is not following the first user and return a proper error message. But you won't be able to detect which mentioned user is not following the first user and return a proper error message. Oh, okay. So I mean, you've got the data there in order to do that. It's just a case of rewriting the query. So what you could do is, at the point where they start to write the message, you could have I guess like a list of users in memory of who follows who. And I guess you probably store that somewhere in memory or in a cache, or you just hit Neo4j for it. So you could just say, like, match user username or is it the people that followed that one? So then we've got the users there. I suppose it depends what the error would be, but I'm assuming like you can only mention people that follow you or you follow. Is that, would that be right? So you probably run the query before you create. So it'd be like a two-step process. So you inside the transaction. So you could do like tx.run match user where or match followers. Then loop through all the people that you followed. If that is, if the users aren't in that array, then throw the error back, and then roll back the transaction. So you're not doing anything against the database. Otherwise, you would carry on and then go through and complete the transaction. Hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to drop me an email or send me a message on Twitter or jump on the community site. If that doesn't answer the question, I'm happy to go into more detail. Actually, if you post it on the community, it'd be better, because then you'll definitely get a response, whereas I might not get back to emails for a few days. Yeah. Cool. All right. So we have done that one. My favorites list. Okay, so this is the feature I was describing before that didn't that we didn't work on. So if you have a movie in your favorites, then it will appear with this little green bookmark, which you can click to remove. If a movie isn't in your favorites, then it will have a blue bookmark. Cool. So everything at the moment should. So right now there's nothing. There's no bookmark there. Oh, we're not logged in. Everything will basically be set to not a favorite, because we're not returning that information at the moment. So what we can do is we can update the movie service to actually find that information. So this is a 2-3 part thing. So firstly, let's look at when we save that rating. If we look in the network tab, when I click that bookmark, it sends a post request to API account favorites, and then the movie ID with no payload, sorry, and then it returns back the information of the movie, and then this favorite flag, which is either true or false. So that's hard coded in there. Oh no, sorry. So that's still returning Goodfellas. So this one's still hard coded. So we need to do this in 3 parts. So in the favorite service, we've got firstly the add method, which we need to implement, which is when you click that button. So first thing we do is we open a session. Session. Make sure we close that session. Await session close. So what we want to do is create the has favorite relationship between the user and the movie. So again, this is like the rating query. To await session dot write transaction, so write into the database. Run. Actually, the user ID and the movie ID. So these are both strings in the database. I'm going to match the user where the user ID property is the value that we pass through. So I want to match the movie, where the movie ID is the movie ID that's supplied, and I want to merge. So merge either find or create the value. So where merge user and then I want to return the everything for the movie, and then so I can just hard code this favorite to be true. The records and return first.get movie. I want to record 2 native types on that as well. Convert the integers back into strings. Okay, so that's the first one. So when we're adding one, then that's what we do. I can kind of pretty much copy this into the remove one. But instead of creating one, I want to delete it. So find me the user, with the user ID that has favorite relationship to the M. Got that with a reference of R. I want to delete R. And then return the value, and again, favorite false on that one. Cool. So that's add and remove done. And then the last thing to do is in a read transaction just to get all of the movies ordered by a certain value. So I'm just going to copy this. Cool. So again, in this one, we open a new session, a read transaction to find all of the users, whether has favorite relationship through to a movie, return the information of that movie, and then the fact that they're a favorite to be true. Nice. So now if I sign in again, I've now got this. So if I click on that little bookmark, I get a 500. See why we're doing, why we've got that. Oh, it's TMDB ID. Sorry, not movie ID. Right, let's try that again. Perfect. So this movie has been added to your favorites. We've returned the favorite flag being true. Now, if I go through to my favorites list, we've now got Band of Brothers on there. If I click that again, it should be removed from my favorites. Favorite false. If I go out and back into that page, there's nothing there. Perfect. So that feature is working. So now if I run this test again, that should give me enough to pass the challenge on Graph Academy. And click verify. So we've now got should be a user in the database with the Graph Academy favorite, and ifshay.com with a favorite relationship to Toy Story, which is great. Perfect. Done that right. So it's 4:40 UK time. We're one away. So now the only thing we need to do is add the favorite flag to the movie service. So I think at the moment, there should just be no value. So if I go back onto the home page, on here it's not remembered that Band of Brothers is one of my favorite movies. So what I need to do is add that into the movie service. So everything that we've done so far has all been one thing inside a transaction, right? So with using the TX and then immediately calling TX.run. Now we could do all of this in the same statement, but for me it makes sense to extract that out into two statements. Then we can use it in other places as well. So basically, what we need to do is inside this OR query, if we have a user ID, then we want to check that there's a relationship between that user and that movie. So Bruce, I mean, this might be the option that you're looking for, or something that you'd be interested in. What we need to do is to basically find a list of movies first and then pass it in as a parameter to this query. So we could do it all in the same Cypher query, but that's a little bit messy. I think instead what we'll do is add it to this get user favorites method. So this get user favorites method expects a transaction object to be passed through, so like any other transaction function that we use, and a user ID, and then we'll return an array of strings, which will be the TMDB IDs for each of the nodes that we're interested in. So to make this foolproof, what we could just say is if the user ID, or if the user ID is undefined, then just return an empty array. Then we don't have to rewrite the query above. Otherwise, we want to get an array of the TMDB IDs. So we can say that the result is await TX run. Match the user, where the user ID is the user ID that we get passed to the function. So we pass that as a parameter. Has favorite in M, then return M dot TMDB ID. And then we want to return an array of strings, so we can say return res.records.map. Each one of those rows, return row.get ID. Right, so now we've got this function, but it's not being used at the moment. Inside this OR query, what I can do is, so wrap this in braces so it's not an immediately returning function. That's another cool thing, Nefi. These instant returning functions and arrow functions. So I can say that the favorites is this dot user favorites. I pass through the transaction and then the user ID. So then I can say pass this through as one of the parameters. So that will either be an array of strings or it'll be an empty array. And then I can say favorite is m.tmdbid is in the list of favorites. Return that function out. And should be good. So there's some tests for this one, test 08. Which has failed because expected list keeper was map. So what have we got? Let's double check what we've got coming out of that favorites function. Ah. So await. So we need to await get user favorites. Oh dear. Good job this isn't being recorded. Right, await. Needs to be an async function. I'll turn await on that one as well. That should now give me a list of strings. Perfect. So I've got an added one. So now if I go back into the UI, check Band of Brothers, it's been added to my favorites. Go to my favorites, it's there, it's ticked. If I go back to the home page, then it should remember. Oh, it's logged me out. So we tick that. Go back and did I give it a UK spelling? No. Right, so it's there. Go back. Have I spelt it right? That's the question. Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely, Peter. Favorite. I figure it's good. Just curious how it saved it. Movie service. is it going into my database? That's the next question. So Brothers is in there. So it has favorite. Under Brothers, Toy Story. Right, so let's take this. Nine one. Seven 502. Two 205300 is there. 26. Yep. And then one. Oh, the user ID is undefined. Interesting. So roots. There we go. I'm feeling confident now. Although I don't know why that's not on that branch. Should be okay. Here we go. Right. So movies sorted by IMDb rating, descending order. Band of Brothers, favorite true. Favorite true for the Civil War. So if I delete Cosmos and the Civil War, there we go. Cool. So let's just, for completeness sake, if I run that, it should tell me that I've completed the course. Pretty happy about that. So now, obviously, I'm going to share my certificate on Twitter and on LinkedIn. When you complete a course, on a live stream. Yeah, so it gives you options to share to your social network of your choice. or you can add it to LinkedIn, or you share it to LinkedIn, sorry, or you can add it to as a certification on your profile. So please, if you do this, go ahead and share it. I'd really appreciate it. I'd love to see these numbers increasing. I'd love to see people sharing. So if I head down to on the page, there I am. Building applications with Node.js. I can click on that, or if any recruiters or people looking to hire me want to look at that, they can click and they can see the certificate on Graph Academy, which is awesome. All right, cool. So I think I've finished that with 4 minutes to spare. Which I'm pretty pleased about. Thank you to everybody who watched all the way through. I know there are a few of you that watched all the way through. Thank you for everyone that's provided a question. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. I am Adam Cowley on Twitter. I am here. This is me. Or you can reach me on the Neo4j Twitch channel, the Neo4j community site, Discord, wherever. So yeah, and if you're interested, then head over to graphacademy.neo4j.com courses, and then at Node.js if you're interested in completing the course. Here's my congratulations, my certificate. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, then feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you on a stream sometime soon. Take care.